This episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast is sponsored in part by Law Enforcement Labor Services in Minnesota.
Law Enforcement Labor Services, also known as LELS, is Minnesota's largest public safety labor union, with over 7,000 Minnesota public safety members serving in all areas of public safety: law enforcement, 911 dispatch centers, corrections, public safety administrative support personnel, and firefighters. Established in 1977, LELS serves over 260 different public safety agencies and over 450 locals across the state of Minnesota. With their administration, general counsel, 3 staff attorneys, and 14 business agents, LELS provides contract negotiations for better wages and benefits, grievance processing and representation, discipline representation, mediation and arbitration, assistance with representation for post-board hearings, and in-line of duty death benefits for survivor families. Find out more about law enforcement labor services at LELS.org. LELS.org.
Episodes of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast may contain strong language and violent content. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sheriff Scott Rose from Minnesota, and I'm your host for today's new episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast.
Walking eastbound.
In each episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast, we'll share the details and the stories of how these men and women heroically lost their lives in the line of duty. Our mission is to help ensure their service and sacrifice is never forgotten. Thanks for spending some time with me today to remember and honor these fallen heroes. January 6th in Detroit, Michigan. Nancy Kerrigan is clubbed on the right leg by an assailant. Tanya Harding's ex-husband, Jeff Gillooly, pleads guilty for his role on the attack of the figure skater, resulting in a conviction of Tanya, a fine of $100,000, and a lifetime ban from figure skating.
In Detroit today, there's been a violent attack on an American athlete. Nancy Kerrigan, the American figure skater, who was widely considered a favorite to win a medal at the Winter Olympics, was attacked at a practice session for the U.S. Figure Skating Championships.
Nancy Kerrigan was making a comeback of sorts from a disastrous year last year, skating well by all accounts.
Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman are murdered outside the Simpson home in Los Angeles this year. NFL star O.J. Simpson and his friend Al Cowlings flee from the police in his white Ford Bronco. Now, this low-speed chase ends at the Simpsons' Brentwood, Los Angeles, California mansion, where he allegedly was going to see his mother. He also surrendered there. O.J. Simpson was later acquitted of the killings, but was held liable in a civil lawsuit.
White or light-colored Ford Bronco. Suspect is possibly armed. Use caution.
I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News in New York, and you are looking at live television pictures at dusk in Southern California. The white Bronco that you see on the freeway going right on your screen contains O.J. Simpson, a fugitive at large, charged with 2 counts of murder. We believe it is being driven by his lifelong friend, Al Cowlings, and they are headed toward O.J. Simpson's old neighborhood in Brentwood.
It was this year that the pilot episode of Friends would air on NBC.
You've made many friends on Thursday night. Now meet Joey.
You need anything, you can always come to Joey. Me and Chandler live right across the hall, and he's away a lot.
Joey, stop hitting on her. It's her wedding day.
What, like there's a rule or something?
Friends, Thursdays this fall on NBC.
The year was 1994. It had been a pretty mild start to the month in Minnesota. Temperatures the first week of March rose into the 50s in the southern part of the state. High temperatures not usually seen until at least the end of March or into April. Mild considering they'd had over 30 inches of snow in that area since the first of the year. Just south of the Twin Cities 7-county metro area, along Interstate 35, is Rice County, Minnesota. Rice County is made up of low rolling hills, primarily devoted to agriculture and dotted with lakes. The county is approximately 560 square miles. 20 square miles of the county is actually water. It's home to the Cannon River, the Zumbro River, and over 24 lakes. It was founded in 1853 and named after Henry Mower Rice, who was a fur trader who became instrumental in the creation of the Minnesota Territory and its growth and its development. He would also serve as one of Minnesota's first senators. There's a marble statue of Senator Rice that was first displayed in the Minnesota Capitol and then was later donated by Minnesota to the National Statuary Hall Collection, displayed in the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The county is home to 7 cities, Northfield and Faribault being the largest. Now, Faribault is the county seat. In 1994, around 50,000 people called Rice County home. Law enforcement in 1994, well, it was very different. There were no cell phones, no computers in the squads, no squad cameras. Many of the old-timers will say it was the best years in law enforcement. Dan Silkey was one of the deputies back then.
I started in 87. Rice County was the elite county that everybody wanted to work for. We never had any drama. We never had any issues. Everybody pulled their weight. Everybody did what they were supposed to do, and every one of the deputies was fun to work with. I believe we had a total of 18, including the sheriff and chief deputy. There was 3 investigators. We had 1 full-time child protection. Then that would have made like 11 or 12 road deputies. And it was at that transition, we had talked to sheriff and going to 10-hour shifts. And we also talked him into take-home squad cars.
One of the veteran deputies at the Rice County Sheriff's Office was 48-year-old Terry Francis Hanson, badge number 116. Terry had served Rice County for the past 8 years. Now, before that, he'd spent 13 years serving the city of Faribault on their police department. He lived in Rice County with his wife Noreen and 4 kids, Wendy, Randy, Troy, and Gary. Noreen and Terry met back in high school.
He worked with a classmate of mine. We went to different high schools. He was a senior and I was a junior. And one night I was taking a girlfriend home out in the country and we kept being followed. And I thought, I don't want to go out in the country, with guys following us. And they pulled up beside us and I recognized my classmate. But they were in Terry's car, so I didn't recognize it. So we talked a while. And the next Monday in school, he said, that guy I was with Friday night? He wants to go out with you. So that's how it started.
The family will tell you that things moved pretty fast with Noreen and Terry after high school.
I graduated in June. I was 18 in July, and we got married in October. We got home from a 3-day honeymoon, and he called his folks to say we were home. And his mom said, I've got some mail here that looks kind of important. And it was his draft papers, and he was gone like 3 weeks later. They didn't give him much time when they decided to draft him back then.
Terry was headed to serve his country in the Vietnam War.
He went over, his MOS was helicopter gunner. But on the way over, somebody said, does anybody know how to type? He had taken 1 year of typing in high school, and he said, I can. So he got to be in the office over there. I mean, it was a tent office because it's out in the middle of nowhere, but still, he didn't have to go up and be a gunner. Not many of those gunners came home. So he lucked out that way. He tried to write almost every day, but I might get a letter 2 days in a row, and then I might not get for a week, and then I'd get 4 or 5 all at once, because the mail wasn't that great back then either. There's no communication like they have nowadays.
When Terry came home, life would quickly change again as he went from newlywed to veteran to father.
Let's see, she was born in January, and he came home that August or September. So she was 6 or 7 months old when he came home. Basic training, he was in Colorado alone. Then they had 3 guys from Faribault, all married, had advanced training for 12 weeks. So us wives went down there for 12 weeks and lived before they went to Vietnam. And that's when it happened.
When Terry was in high school, he worked for a local fruit market. When he got back from the war, that same company offered him a job in a neighboring city. So he and Noreen moved there for 1.5 years or so before he applied for a job at the Faribault Police Department. He would serve as an officer in Faribault for 12 years before being offered a deputy sheriff position with the Rice County Sheriff's Office. Terry was loved by his family and by his community. He enjoyed cutting wood, gardening, and fishing with the kids. Sometimes.
My mother's parents had a cabin on French Lake just outside of town, and Dad had a boat, and we kept it out there. We'd all go out fishing all the time. He also, when he would get tired of us kids at the cabin, then he'd put the stickers on the boat that said Water Patrol, and then he'd go out and tell us he had to go to work. So then he could have his quiet time.
Randy was Terry's oldest son and remembers Terry always keeping tabs on the kids.
I was probably the problem child. Didn't like school. But anytime I skipped school, no matter where I ended up, somehow, if he was working, he knew where I was. For years, I thought he had a tracker on me, because it didn't matter where I'd go, day or night, he would show up sometime to let me know somehow that he knew where I was and what I was doing.
Wendy was Terry's only daughter.
A lot of times he would show up at our sporting events or at a family gathering in his uniform. He would come in and take his lunch break to be able to spend that little bit of time with us, watching our activities or being a part of a family event, when he knew he had to go right back to work. But he really made an effort to spend what time he could at those events.
His last Christmas, Gary was in a Christmas program, and Terry would come in uniform. He happened to be working that evening and stood out in the back corner so that he could watch. But if he got a call, then he'd just have to leave. But he tried to come to as many of the kids' things as he could, even in uniform.
Growing up in Rice County back in the 90s, there were no cell phones, no internet, no easy way to keep track of the kids. So parents did it old school back then.
Once I got a little bit older, and of course was the first one to have a car, Dad never gave me a curfew. He always said as long as I was reasonable about when I came home, he would not give me a curfew. But if I was ever unreasonable, that would change. But then he would be sitting up, waiting for me when I would come home. If he was not working, he would be sitting in the dark, waiting, and when I would come in, he would make me sit down and play a game of cribbage with him before I could go to bed so he could check and see how my night was. Yep, I would have to sit and play cribbage with him before I could go to bed. I think it was his way of making sure I was sober and behaving myself. Yep.
Their youngest son, Gary, was only 7 years old in 1994. He has few memories of his father at that age, but he does remember the police station, and he remembers Dad taking him to Gary's first movie.
I remember there were quite a few times he took me into the police station with him into the law enforcement center when he was picking up his check or just had a meeting or something quick. So I remember going in there with him quite a few times. Oh, I remember the first movie I saw, he took me to Jurassic Park. Well, the first movie in theaters anyway. And the theater was pretty empty that day. It was kind of scary to see that movie that age. It was just him and I.
The thing I would always remember about Terry is on Fridays on payday, if he was off, his little boy Gary was holding on to that big fingers of Terry, and they'd walk in, and the checks were always in the mailbox. And little Gary would go over to the candy machine, and he'd pound on that window. And I remember Terry going over, reaching in his pocket. If not, he'd get changed, but he'd always buy Gary something. Then he'd sit there and he'd BS with us guys if we were working or whatever, anything going on or whatever. But just a sweetheart of a man and a good father.
Retired Deputy Pete Dahl was a young rookie back in 1994, working with Terry.
He'd been a cop a long time, and he Faribault guy, and then he transferred to the county, and he loved the young guys. He was one of those guys that was just nice. He didn't have a mean bone in his body, but he was so good to me. He loved to go to coffee and talk, and the absolute nicest guy you'd ever meet. Just a gentle giant.
It was Friday, March 11th, 1994. Now, before we get started, because the suspects in the story were all juveniles at the time of the incident, and per the request of the Hanson family, we won't use their real names. There were 3 teenagers, 2 females, and 1 male involved in the beginning of this. Now, for the purposes of this story, we'll call them Christina, Shannon, and David. Shannon was assigned runaway. She had taken off from her parents' home a couple days prior and ran into Christina and her brother David in town. Shannon would later cite problems at home with her father and his heavy drinking. Christina and David had been living with their father at the time and cited issues as well. The three kids were hanging out in Faribault, and they came up with the idea that they would run away to California. Christina suggested they steal a car. Initially, the kids planned to hang out at the Holiday gas station in town and wait for a car to be left running while the owner was putting gas in it. Christina indicated that she would drive, and if they got pulled over and the cops asked for vehicle registration, she would take off and would not stop. Shannon, well, she didn't like the Holiday gas station idea. Christina then said that her mom had a friend who had a vehicle she always left unlocked with the keys in it. At this point, David left and decided to go roller skating downtown, so it was just Christina and Shannon. The two girls then walked to Christina's mother's friend's place, and they found the vehicle. It was a 1984 red and black Chevy Blazer parked at the house. They walked up to the Blazer. Shannon got in and sat in the passenger seat. Christina got in and sat behind the wheel. The keys were in the ignition like Christina said they would be. The Blazer was reported stolen at approximately 7:12 p.m. to the Faribault Police Department, and they'd advised all law enforcement to be on the lookout for it. The two girls then drove to the skating rink to get David, but David didn't want to leave yet, so the girls went to a friend's house for a brief time and then returned to the rink to get David. This time, he wasn't there. They left the rink and were driving by Grandpa Al's bar, which is an iconic Faribault bar that's been in business there since 1929. Now, when Terry, who was patrolling, recognized the vehicle they were in as stolen, he called it out to dispatch, and he activated his red lights by City Hall. It was 7:30 p.m. Christina pulled over and stopped. And as Terry stopped, got out of his squad and walked towards the Blazer, she took off. Pete and Dan were about 1.5 blocks north of where Terry was. It was prime rib night at the VFW.
I came in early on my shift because Terry and I worked opposites. And so I had told Terry, I said, my brother is cooking prime rib at the local VFW, and I'd like to get you prime rib tonight. And that was the plan. And so Pete and I showed up together at the VFW, and Terry was on his way. And then I heard Terry say, "What was the plate on that stolen vehicle again?" And I went, "Oh boy, here we go." And Terry says, "Yeah, I got it here on 4th and 2nd Avenue." And so I hadn't checked on yet at that time. Well, then I turned around and Pete was gone. And I thought, well, I got to catch up to these guys. And so by the time I got to my squad, I could hear the sirens.
Dan and I, his brothers are chefs, and Dan and I had gone into VFW then. His brothers were cooking. So he and I had gone in there. I think there were some other guys going to meet us for a break, right? It was like when those guys cooked, the place was full house. And I heard Terry call on the radio and say, "I think I've spotted the stolen vehicle." And then he starts reading it out, and he said something on the radio, and I dropped my plate and went out the door. And I went to get my car, and I hear the siren, and I see him go by, and he's calling a chase. And I went westbound on 4th Street, and like I said, Dan and I were like a block away. So I just jumped in my car and took off after him.
Faribault officer Hartwig was also close and got behind Terry. Pete then joined the pursuit behind Hartwig. They were westbound on 4th Street in the city of Faribault. The red and black Blazer, followed by 2 county squads and the city squads, lights and sirens activated. Speeds accelerated to 60 to 65 miles per hour. They observed the Blazer driving recklessly around vehicles and through intersections. They continued to pursue the Blazer, who went through the intersection of Highway 60 and Highway 21 at speeds of 60 to 70 miles per hour.
We went west out of Faribault and through that intersection, 4th Street and 8th Avenue, and they were just flying. We were in the westbound lane going west and went through Highway 60, that turns into Highway 60, Highway 21 there at Lyndale, and just heading west out of town.
The pursuit then continued west on Highway 60 near the I-35 ramps. Now, the Blazer drove up the northbound ramp to I-35, then turned off into the median, spinning around, got off the ramp, and then started heading down towards Highway 60.
So they jumped on like they were going to go on the interstate, and then it was obviously snow was marching. So then they wiped out, kind of spun out, and then they kind of bajaed back onto the highway, but now they're going eastbound in the westbound lane. I ended up right behind Terry, and Terry was still behind them.
The Blazer then turned west in the eastbound traffic lane, forcing oncoming traffic off the roadway, past the Dairy Queen, and then back into the westbound lane at 80 to 90 miles per hour. The Blazer continued at a high rate of speed, crossing the center line, driving erratically, forcing cars and pedestrians off the roadway. As they neared the intersection of I-35 and Highway 60, Terry drove around the Blazer and got in front of it in an attempt to slow it down. The Blazer slowed for a few seconds, then it accelerated around Terry's squad into the oncoming traffic lane. As the Blazer passed Terry's squad, the vehicle swerved and rammed the driver's side of Terry's squad car.
That was the days of the rolling roadblock, right? Where you try to get around, one car tried to get around them and like slow them down or warn traffic. And so Terry kept trying to get around them, and they started hammering on his car. And they hit him so hard that the lights went off. And we were moving, right? So his lights kept going off, and then they stayed off. So I called them and I said, "Hey, they knocked your lights out. I'll take primary." And he was having none of that. He was like, "You don't know what you're doing, where you're going." Like, I think he knew that I wasn't probably ready for that. That's pretty new down there, and he knew he was wet behind the ears, right? And yeah, we kept going out west, and Terry tried to go around them a few times, and they hit him. They would broadside him.
Speeds were now increasing to 90 to 100 miles per hour. Remember, these guys had no idea who they were chasing. They had no idea it was two kids driving the Blazer. Near the intersection of Highway 60 and County Road 44 in Morristown, Terry again attempted to get in front of the Blazer to slow it down. The Blazer again sped up into oncoming traffic, got beside Terry, and rammed him again on the driver's side of the squad car. The pursuit speeds were now still 90 to 100 miles per hour as they left Rice County and entered into LeSueur County. The LeSueur County deputies had been monitoring the pursuit, and they were ready with a roadblock just west of the entrance to Sakatah State Park. As the pursuit crested the hill, they could see the roadblock, a couple of LeSueur County squads blocking the highway.
The truck we were chasing dynamites their brakes, and then Terry hits his brakes, and the Blazer comes to a stop, and Terry stops behind the car, and so I'm thinking, okay, we're going to do a felony stop. And so as I kind of go around to the left of Terry's squad, I see the Blazer turn its wheels to the left and start moving like they're going to take off again. And since they had already gone through the median and been driving like crazy, I went around Terry and slammed into the side of him. Stop it.
Pete then accelerated around Terry's squad and rammed the driver's side of the Blazer behind the left front tire, stopping the vehicle and pinning the doors closed. Pete got out, drew his handgun, and ordered the occupants to place their hands in the air. At this time, other officers were arriving to assist, and they took both Christina and Shannon into custody.
Yeah, the car had just been put in the ditch, and I rolled up. I remember I didn't want to go pedal to the metal and try to catch up, because I know there was 2 or 3 squads up there, and then we were going to have LeSueur County and Waterville in there. So I was watching. I seen a couple of cars pulled off to the side of the road, and I remember slowing down past that one. I didn't know whether it was hit or not, but I think they must have got pretty shook up because they were sitting there. But Pete was doing a good job of calling it all out. Yeah, I think he was trying to. What was Terry? I remember him saying that Terry's light bar went out. Yeah, and he said, "If you want to back off, I'll take over." And I remember Terry not saying anything, and he never even responded. He said, "I'm just staying with it." And that was the mentality. Yeah, they were the protector, and you get behind me. Them guys, they were fearless. They really were.
The girls were now in handcuffs. They were separated in the back of 2 squad cars, while Pete, Dan, and Terry were standing by the vehicles waiting for the tow trucks to arrive and clear the scene.
I go back up to where my car is up against theirs and Terry's is behind it, and because we had pulled the passenger out the passenger side, right? It's in the ditches there and it's snowy or whatever, and he was really excited, and then he went down.
And so we were waiting for a tow truck, and I was standing next to Terry. And Terry was, he was visibly shook up. This was, it was obvious that, the stress had gotten to him, but, he was a seasoned officer. And I'm watching him, and he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a cigarette. And when he was trying to light that cigarette, I said, Terry, everything all right? I said, you okay? And he blacked out on me and he fell right at my feet.
Without warning, Terry falls forward, strikes his head against Pete's squad, and falls to the ground. Dan and Pete were shocked. They rolled Terry over and they checked for vitals. There was no breathing and no pulse. They started CPR.
Pete worked for an ambulance on part-time, and so he always kept a bigger bag in his squad car. And so we started CPR on Terry.
Dan yelled at me to get my bag, and I ran over my squad, and I think I had to go to the driver's side, but I pulled my EMT bag out and came back around, and Dan and I did CPR on Terry. Some people were like, Terry didn't have a head injury, but the posture, right? It was kind of like that, except he grabbed a hold of my collar and tie and Dan's arm, I think, and then, because there's a brief second there where, he's going to be okay, and then he goes back down. But
he come around and he sat up. He grabbed me by my, I think it was my left arm, and then he grabbed Pete by around the neck, his tie, and his eyes were wide open. And I thought, God, we got him back. And he laid right back down, and then, checked the pulse, no pulse. I said, let's keep going. And I looked at Pete and I said, where's the rescue squad? And Pete said, I never called. I said, oh my God. And we were the only 2 uniforms there. Everybody left. And I said, go call. And so I kept compressions, kept working on him. And Terry was a big guy. He was a big boy. And it was, I was sweating working on him. And there is not a better sound than hearing the rescue squad coming.
Yeah, so we just kept working on him until North Ambulance got there, and then it was a blur, right? Like Dan and I are just working on him, and so that's when the tunnel vision comes in, right? All I remember is Dan and I working on him, and it could have been 5 seconds, it could have been 5 hours. But then all of a sudden the medics are showing up. I stayed with the medics for a little bit, and there was a lot of help there, and then it kind of becomes a blur again.
Dan and Pete did CPR on Terry for several minutes until medical arrived, and then continued to assist Morristown Rescue, Waseca Ambulance, Gold Cross, and North Ambulance in the treatment of Terry. Terry's son Randy had been home in Waterville that night with his young daughter, waiting for his wife to get done from work so he could go pick her up. On his way out to get his wife, he talked to one of the local officers who told him something was going on Highway 60.
I stopped at the gas station in town that night to fill up my car, talked to the Morristown police officer at the time. We were just BSing at the pumps. He said he had to leave because there was something going on Highway 60 right outside of town. And I said, okay, see you later, Randy. His name was Randy also. And then I fueled up and I started heading down Highway 60 west to go to Waterville. Got just about to Waterville, and there was a bunch of lights on the highway. And I pulled up, and I believe it was one of the tow truck drivers came back and told me I had to go all the way back to Morristown and around the lake to get to Waterville because there was an issue going on, an incident. I just looked at him. He knew who I was. I was actually driving one of my dad's cars at the time, his Mustang convertible, and he knew me, and he just looked at me, and I could kind of tell something was going on. So I asked him to stay with my daughter, and I got out and walked up there.
Randy knew something was wrong.
And so I was wringing wet, and I stepped back, and I probably went back about 20 yards, and Terry was on the ground in front of a squad car. And I stepped back, and I had a hand was put on my shoulder. I turned around. I couldn't believe it, but it was Randy, his son.
I guess I kind of, from there, I was kind of blanked out. Dan Silky told me, I walked up, put my hand on his shoulder and said, "What's up?" So
and I said, "What are you doing here?" He goes, "I'm trying to get to Waterville. You guys got the road. Was that my dad?" And I said, "Yeah, it's Dad." I said, "Come on." I said, "It's not good, Randy." I said, "Let's go up." And so I walked with Randy there, and he got down on both knees and, expected what a son would do with his dad laying there.
He walked me up to where Dad was laying.
And I stood by him and put my hand on his shoulder, and
then he said I should probably go back, get my wife, and go find my mom.
North Ambulance transported Terry to District 1 Hospital, where they continued to try and save him. The blur that Pete talks about, that tunnel vision, that happens when the body is put under extreme stress. And under that kind of extreme stress, the stress of the pursuit, the stress of Pete seeing that car ram Terry, the stress of worrying about the other civilians on the roadway, worried about the other drivers on the roadway, the pedestrians on the roadway, the stress of seeing a veteran like Terry go down and then having to do CPR, then seeing Terry sit up and then go back down again. That's the kind of stress that causes tunnel vision. Also, to protect you, often the brain will suppress stressful memories. Pete was trained to be a medic. He had served his country in Iraq. He had been through stressful events before, but it had been 30 years since the incident with Terry, and Pete had no memory of what happened after the medics got there. Until we interviewed him about this incident and shared his report with him from that night. It wasn't until then that Pete remembered he never stopped doing CPR. He continued working on Terry with the paramedics in the ambulance all the way to the hospital.
God, that's right. Because my car was busted up and they were going to, I just kept doing CPR. God, no wonder I couldn't remember how the hell I got to the hospital. Yeah, I always prided myself on not having tunnel vision, but I can say that when Terry went down, I remember Dan and the medics, and I knew, that's crazy.
Nowadays, when it comes to notifying law enforcement families when an officer's down, law enforcement's biggest fear is getting to the officer's family before social media does. Back then, it was police scanners. Cops called it Scannerland. And back in those days, it was more common than not for people to have scanners in their homes to listen to what was happening in your community, especially if you were a cop's family.
Yeah, I usually work noon because he worked, like I say, 6 at night. But they had a party that night, and the night waitress asked if I'd come in and help her. And I thought, well, Terry's working. Sure, I'll work. Well, her husband was listening to the scanner home with their little girl, and he called and he said, something's going on. Tell Noreen to call Terry. And I did, and I paced and I paced and I paced. They never, of course, you didn't have the phones in the cars at that time. And the dispatcher usually will say, I'll get a hold of him and he'll call you. She put me on hold for like 10 minutes or better because she didn't want to tell me what was going on. She called one of the city guys in to tell me to get up to the hospital. There was a nurse in the restaurant at the time, and she said, you're not driving anywhere, I'm taking you. And I said, but my car's here, we'll get it later. So she went, took me up, and stayed until some of the kids got there.
Before Noreen left the restaurant, she called Wendy.
We were just getting ready to get Mitchell ready for bed, and the phone rang, and it was my mom. And I remember her saying, something has happened to Dad. I don't know what yet, but we need you to get here and meet us at the hospital. Yeah, that's all she said. That's all I knew. And so we grabbed Mitch and grabbed whatever we needed, and we were out the door. And I was just shaking all the way back to Faribault. And thankfully, my husband was the calmer one and was able to drive.
Noreen arrived at the hospital and was placed into a family room. Now, at that point, she didn't know if Terry was still alive because they had put her in the waiting room and never said anything to her. So Noreen initially thought they were still working on Terry. Their youngest son, Gary, was being watched that night at Grandma's at Terry's mother's house while Noreen was working. So when the family pastor arrived, Randy and the pastor went to notify Terry's mom.
I went with Sheriff Swaystaw to my dad's mom's house in town, to Grandma Laura's, because I had a brother at the time who was like 7 years old, and Grandma was babysitting him that night. So I went with Sheriff Swaystaw and Pastor Snyder over to Grandma's house to tell her what had happened.
Gary was just 7 years old when he was told that his father had died.
I was at Grandma's house. Randy was the one that came and told us. I know that the pastor was there, but I don't remember him being there. I remember it was Randy that told me.
Randy and their pastor brought Terry's mom and Gary to the hospital. Shortly after that, Wendy and her husband arrived. The family was then notified that Terry had died, and they were told that they could go in and see him.
We walked into the hospital, and I think I had tunnel vision at that point. I saw Mom and I saw my brothers, but I don't remember visually seeing law enforcement presence there. I know there were, but I don't remember seeing that. And then at that point, I was told that he had died, and did I want to go see him? Which, I mean, that was just, I don't know, do I? You know, I couldn't even process that he was gone, let alone thinking about going in by myself to see him. Yeah, at that point, I was in shock.
Due to Terry dying during this incident, Rice County requested the assistance of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to assist with the investigation and interviews of the two girls. There was definitely a conflict of interest here, with Rice County losing one of their own during the incident. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or BCA for short, is a statewide criminal investigative bureau headquartered in St. Paul. In some states, it would be similar to state police. The BCA provides expert forensic science and criminal investigation services to agencies throughout the state, specifically for complex investigations like homicides, high-profile missing persons, in-custody deaths, and officer-involved shootings. The BCA has the financial backing of the state to be able to provide technology and expertise that many agencies don't have in these types of cases. During the interviews, investigators determined that both girls came from troubled homes. Both admitted to the theft of the vehicle, and Shannon told investigators she told Christina 20 to 30 times to stop. They indicated their intentions were to steal the Blazer, to go to South Dakota, and then on to California to go meet somebody out there. Now, they never revealed who that actual someone was. Christina was transported to the New Ulm detention facility to be held in lieu of charges. Due to the alleged problems at home, Shannon was also held and transported to the Harbor Shelter in Burnsville and placed on a 72-hour hold. After the interviews, all reports and documentation were submitted to the county attorney's office for consideration of the following charges against both girls: second-degree assault, which is the use of a vehicle striking Terry's squad during the pursuit, theft of motor vehicle and fleeing, and criminal vehicular homicide. Terry's funeral was held on Tuesday, March 15th at Trinity Lutheran Church in Faribault, with Reverend Robert E. Snyder officiating.
Dear family, dear relatives, dear fellow officers, dear community members, we've gathered here to pay our last respects and lay to rest a husband, a father, a relative, a brother and friend in Christ. As we do so, we look to comfort to God's holy word.
Uniformed officers from all over Minnesota attended to honor Terry and his family. City officers, county deputies, and state troopers, all saluting this fallen hero. In addition to hundreds of law enforcement who came out to honor Terry that day, hundreds of citizens also came out, including some who knew Terry only as Deputy Hanson.
I remember someone telling Mom at the funeral he had been arrested by my dad a couple times, and he said if you were going to be arrested, you wanted Terry to be the one to arrest you because no matter what you did or how you screwed up, he always treated you with respect. And I think that really sums up who my dad was and how he approached his job.
After the church service, a police motorcade stretched along the bends of Willow Street, escorting Terry's body to Meadow Ridge Memorial Park.
My memories are more from being out at the cemetery. First of all, it was cold, and we had to wait for that long procession to come in. And so being the first ones there, you're sitting there in the cold waiting for everybody else to get in and get lined up and get ready. So I remember that being a really long time. I cannot hear the 21 gun salute without shuddering and the bagpipes without crying. Yep, those are just haunting sounds that don't ever go away.
From that particular day, I do remember the bagpipes. I hated the sound of bagpipes for a very long time. Now I don't mind it, but for a very long time I hated them.
The American flag that had been covering Terry's casket was folded and then presented to Noreen, who was holding their youngest son, 7-year-old Gary.
I remember little Gary. It's almost like that JFK scene. You know, that look of that little guy that's not going to have his dad protect him and take care of him. I do remember seeing Gary, but I don't remember the funeral. I don't remember going to the cemetery. I don't. Wow. It was hard. It was a hard, him and Noreen, they were tongue-in-cheek, them two. You could tell that they were always happy. I never seen the other, but during that whole incident and all that coming in up to the hospital and seeing Noreen there, and I just went, oh man.
Internment was held at the Meadow Ridge Memorial Park in Faribault, with veterans' memorial rights provided at the gravesite by the Faribault Veterans Services Organizations. For me, doing these projects, doing these stories, it's always interesting to talk to families and officers about the funerals to see what some people remember and what some people don't. What memories stick out for them. Some people remember unique things like sounds, like smells or things they saw. But some, like the folks in this story, have very little memory of it. Terry Hanson was the first line of duty death in the history of the Rice County Sheriff's Office. Unfortunately, he would not be the last. Just 2 years later, another high-speed pursuit, yet another stolen vehicle, took the life of 40-year-old investigator John Liebenstein. In this pursuit, like Terry's pursuit, the suspect chose to use the stolen vehicle as a weapon, and he rammed John's squad. He deliberately rammed John's squad car with the stolen vehicle at over 90 miles per hour, killing John. Terry was able to get the girls stopped and arrested without them getting hurt or killed. Christina was bound and determined she was going to get to California and vowed not to stop for any cop, which likely would have ended in a crash, either with another squad or an innocent family on the roadway or someone walking across the street. A crash that could have easily killed both girls and others. Ironically, Terry ended up losing his life, likely saving the lives of these two, whose reckless actions contributed to Terry suffering a fatal and massive heart attack. In the end, the driver of the stolen vehicle, the 16-year-old girl, would plead guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree assault and was sentenced to 9 to 12 months in a residential treatment facility in St. Cloud, 200 hours of community service work, and restitution for the damaged vehicles. The Hanson family, they didn't agree with the plea or the sentence. At the end of the sentencing in court, Noreen was quoted as saying, "If Terry's death would guarantee that you would never get into trouble again, you know what he would say? He would say it was worth it." That's the way he was. The loss of his father taught Randy that every day is a gift.
It made me a different type of parent, because now I know things aren't a given for, as in life. So let's try to do things now. Let's not put everything off. Let's try to live for today, because tomorrow's not always going to be there. When I got the grandkids or the kids, and when they do come out, I try to spend the time with them, not, some people, they'll just go play. I try to play with them, because tomorrow I might not be able to.
Gary was just 7 years old when Terry died. Friends and family believe that while Gary was born many years later, 20 years later than Wendy actually, there was a reason Gary was here.
That was such a blessing, because that was her reason for having to get up every day after Dad died. She had somebody that she had to get up for, and that really, because the rest of us were all out of the house by then, and that really made a difference for her, I believe.
Terry's story and his death is another reminder of the stressors in law enforcement. Unfortunately, law enforcement has taken a long time to recognize the importance of managing stress, of recognizing that it's okay not to be okay, that our cops need to be able to talk about the stress of the job and work through it. Back when Terry was a cop, you were told not to talk about cases to anyone, not to take it home, not to discuss it, period. You were to suck it up and just go to the next call.
He was also somebody who really hid his worry and his work stress by internalizing it. Very rarely did he talk about it, or did he show anything. I do remember one night he came home and he was shaking, and he had gone to a motorcycle accident. And he was first on the scene. It was out of town. He was first on the scene. And when he saw the person laying in the ditch, he had the same jacket as my younger brother, Troy, and the same haircut and style and body build. And all my dad could think of as he got out of the car was, what was he doing driving a motorcycle? And went running down thinking he was going to find his son. And it wasn't. That was the one time I remember seeing him really shaken by his job. But I do know there were a few things he talked to Mom about, a few things that really stressed him out. He had shared with her, but he really internalized his job.
Studies show that law enforcement officers are at a higher risk for heart disease. While it's true heart disease can happen to anyone, law enforcement officers are at particular risk. This is largely due to their physically demanding job, which often requires them to work long hours, be on alert for long periods of time, demanding work and shift schedules, overtime, court work, and traumatic events and threats that impact physical and psychological health. It's so important for today's cops to take care of both their physical and mental health. According to an article on policeone.com, police officers are 25 times more likely to die of a heart attack than be killed by the violent action of a suspect. The article goes on to say that those that have a heart attack, on average, are likely to have one at age 46. These are sobering numbers. In a 2020 screening of approximately 6,500 cops in multiple states in the United States, researchers found the incidence of what they called preclinical heart disease, or heart disease before any symptoms are present, was discovered in over 50% of the officers they tested. Early blockages were detected in otherwise fit-appearing men and women as early as age 30. Identifying and treating blockages before they develop further is critical in maintaining officer wellness. Published data shows that between the ages of 55 and 60, the chance of a civilian dying from a heart attack is 1.9%. In the law enforcement community, it's 56%. Long story short, it's so important that our cops take care of themselves, their physical health, and their mental health. Screening programs for heart disease, peer support and counseling programs for mental health, annual wellness checks, or we call them checkups from the neck up. The reality is, these men and women can be in the best physical shape of their lives, but if they aren't taking care of their mental health, they are at risk, and they can still struggle.
I truly believe that if I trained hard, I worked out, I shot all the time, I remember our drill instructors just pounded into mental prep, and if you prepare your mind for where your body's going to go, so like all these scenarios of you plan for them, you rehearse them in your head, and they say if you've been there physically, you've been there mentally, it doesn't matter, you've been there and you handle it better. And that's just how I just you just train, and that's how you live, and that's how I was as a soldier too. And and the reality is that you can be physically really tough and think you're mentally tough, but you whitewash a lot of stuff, or you stuff it away because you just didn't learn how, or you're not smart enough, or I'm probably too immature to accept or even allow myself to let that creep in, right?
I compare cumulative stress to a pond of water. Now, we've all got our own pond of water. Each incident our men and women go through on the street is a stressful event. We're called to help citizens in the worst times of their lives, and all of us process this stress, these calls, a little different. Some calls bug us more than others. Each call is a stone getting thrown into your pond. For some calls, they may be a smaller stone. A car crash with minor injuries, for example. Stressful, but you process it okay. That small stone causes a ripple effect that goes on for a short time, and eventually it calms down. Now add a dead child to that car crash. That stone likely turns into a big stone, a big ripple effect. But again, eventually the water calms down and the pond looks fine. Everything appears to be okay at the surface. All while, underneath, there's a pile of rocks building up over a career, and at some point, when you least expect it, your pond, it can't take another rock, and they start to surface. Then you'll be forced to address that pile, that cumulative stress that you've taken on over your years of service. This was an incident that really affected Pete. He was the new kid there. He'd only known Terry for just over a year, but the incident really affected him. Yet he let the rock go under. The ripples settle, and he went on with life. He went on with his career. Tunnel vision, suppressed memories, and emotions all came back when he was discussing this event. If you're in law enforcement, regardless of your position or your rank, make sure you watch out for your fellow officers. Remember, it's okay not to be okay. You can't just unsee the terrible things you'll see in this career. You need to make sure you and your partners have a chance to vent and discuss high-stress incidents. Now, some agencies do diffusings the night of the incident. Many do debriefings with counselors within 48 hours of the incident. Many require visits to counselors even before coming back from high-stress incidents. These are all important steps to make sure our cops are healthy, both physically and mentally. If you're a family of a law enforcement officer, a spouse, kids, parents, or even a close friend, watch out for them. If you see behavior that doesn't seem right, you need to say something. You need to share your concerns. They may not even realize what they're doing or how they're behaving, but you need to talk to somebody about it. Stress like that can lead to heart attacks like Terry's. It can also lead to suicide, which takes more cops each year in the United States than line-of-duty deaths. Stress is a silent killer within law enforcement. If you combine regular exposure to acute stress, like Terry's pursuit, with the cumulative stress taken over years of serving, stress not addressed, stones left underwater without being addressed, you add that to any level of health concerns. It could be some physical health issues, especially as we get older, or it could be something as simple as a lack of sleep, or overexertion, or one of many things that happen to us when we're in law enforcement. We see it time and time again with law enforcement officers. This stress, this silent killer, it often catches up with them. And without it being treated, without it being addressed, it often causes an event, like Terry's heart attack. Dan and Pete, along with the paramedics, the first responders, and the hospital staff, they did everything they could to save Terry, but it wasn't meant to be. If Terry were here today, he'd want us to take away a few lessons from his story. First, remember, family is everything. He loved his wife and his kids. They meant everything to him. He would tell us to never take that for granted and spend every time you can with them, and always make sure they know you love them. Second, make every day count. Tomorrow is not promised. Nothing is promised. We are gifted with moments. Each one is precious. Each one is different. Never take that for granted. Third, as the mentor he was, the veteran deputy who was always looking out for the younger guys, he'd want his story to remind the men and women serving to take care of themselves, both their physical health and their mental health. He'd remind leadership that their responsibility, along with their officers, is to promote not only good physical health, but to promote a working environment where it's okay not to be okay. To provide our men and women with the support they need to continue to serve our communities and our families to the best of their abilities. Almost 10 years after Terry died, his son Randy decided to go into law enforcement, serving the same sheriff's office his dad served for, serving with some of the same people his dad served with. Randy is now planning his retirement, something his father never had the opportunity to do. Terry Hanson was a hero, not because of how he died, but because of how he lived, in the eyes of his family, his fellow officers, and his community. With the help of Terry's beautiful family, his amazing friends like Pete and Dan, and listeners like you listening to and sharing Terry's story, together we can help ensure the service and sacrifice of Rice County Deputy Terry Hanson will never be forgotten.
Walking eastbound.
Thank you for spending the time to listen, learn about, and honor the memory of this fallen hero. Make sure you take the time to thank your local law enforcement for their service and their sacrifice. And don't forget to thank their families too. They also sacrifice so much for our safety. It's up to us to help ensure the sacrifices made by these fallen heroes and by their families are never forgotten. So please share this podcast with family and friends. Until next time, this is the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. I'm Scott Rose. Thanks for listening.